Okay, today's daf we're going to be learning is Pesachim Lamed Daled. Today's daf is sponsored by Susan Yeager in memory of her beloved mother, Beatrice Yeager, who died 22 years ago this month and whose present I still feel every day in my life. Okay, we're going to start with the bottom of Lamed Gimel Amud Bet. We went in depth, Gufa, that's when we mentioned something, and then the Gemara says, I want to go more in depth into this and understand it better. But I always compare it to a link in a website, right? You link onto something and you can go and see all about it. So, madlikim b'shpat u'b'shemen shel truma shenitmet. You can take bread or oil that was truma but became impure and is useless other than for burning, and you can save it for burning. And we said we're not worried shema yavo b'han lidei takala, that someone might accidentally think. And why is that? We said because you could put it in either the oil they put in a disgusting utensil, and then everyone knew that this is not, no one would want to eat it from there, or they threw the bread with the wood and the bread gets disgusting. But they said that's only, Rava and Abai said, only those things, but not chitim. If you have the kernels of the wheat, it would be a problem because they don't get destroyed. Rabbi Yochanan said even chitim, and the Gemara says why? And then they said, and that's where we ended yesterday at the very end of the last page, beginning of our page. Bishli kata umi sata. It's where you cook them, and it's a bit of a debate whether, and they already are disgusting, or Rashi claims Haim nim asot. They will become disgusting once you throw them with the wood, right? Once they're already cooked, they're going to get bad right away, just like the bread. So just like Rav Ashi answered somewhere else, and this happens very often where the Gemara takes kind of an answer someone gave in a different case and says, oh, we can apply that answer here. So hachanami, also here, b'shli kata umi sata. Just like he said it there, we can use the same answer here. So the obvious question is, where did Rav Ashi say that somewhere else? Hey chait mar de Rav Ashi. On the following thing that Rabbi Avin said in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, Abba Shaul Gabal Shabet Rebbe Haya. We saw Abba Shaul just yesterday and the day before. Now we find out that he was the person who kneaded the dough in the house of Rebbe. They would cook, they would boil hot water for him, right? Use hot water in a dough. They would boil the hot water for him using the wheat of the truma, the wheat kernels of truma that had become disqualified in order to do his isa b'tahara. It was still considered tahor, okay? So here you see he was using chitim of impure. And amai, okay, I see Gita, you're asking, I'm going to get back to that question in 1 minute, okay? Amai, nichush dilma ati behulidei takala. So they said, why? Wouldn't, if you left those kernels of chitim around, it should create a problem. So, it must be that they used kernels that were already cooked and therefore they became disgusting and therefore there was no concern anyone was going to actually eat them. Okay, now, what was Truma doing in the house of Rebbe, Truma Tmeah? Just because it's Tmeah doesn't mean everyone else can use it. So there's a big question asked here. Many different answers were given. If you look in Rashi, Rashi says, because remember, the truma goes to the Kohen and then it becomes impure, right? But it belongs to the Kohen. If it belonged to the Kohen, what's Rebbe doing with it? He wasn't a Kohen. So the Gemara says, Rashi says in the third line in Rashi, the Kohanim didn't always have so much to do with them. So what they do, they sold it in the shuk for very cheap. So they must have sold it to Rebbe for a cheap price. And he bought it and he used it, okay? Interesting answer because first of all, Rebbe was quite wealthy. It's not like he needed to go buy things cheap, but maybe that's why he was wealthy. He saved his money by buying inexpensive items. Anyway, some people say there were Kohanim at his table and maybe then it was allowed for him because even if, some people say Rebbe was Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. He had a lot of people at his house all the time. And some people say it's only Asher D'Rabbanan and therefore here it was Tzorchei Rabim and for the purpose of many, sometimes we allow things that are forbidden on a rabbinic level. So there's a lot of answers given to this question, but it's really a good question what he was doing here. So anyway, I like that response. Maybe he was doing it to give the Kohanim parnasah, right? He wanted to be able to buy things from them. That's a nice answer. Okay, anyway, big question how exactly this came about. But the point is we weren't using it for that. That's just an aside, a question about this, how that could have been. Abai bar Avi, now we're going to have a bit of a story. Not exactly a story, it's a halachic conversation that went on, but it's a bit of it in a story form. And you're going to see something interesting that happens here. This format, by the way, is found in a number of different places. where, well, you'll see the format. I'll talk to you about it in a minute, but I'll just tell you that this format is actually more common than you would have thought. Abaye bar Avin v'Rav Hananya bar Avin. These are two brothers. Tanu Trumot be Rabba. Okay, two brothers were learning in the house of Rabba. They were learning Hilchot Trumot, right? The Mishnayot probably. Paga behu Rava bar Matna. So Rava bar Matna meets them, and Amar lehu Mayim aritu b'Trumot be'Rav. What are they saying about Trumot in the house of your rabbi, right? What's going on in the Beit Midrash today? What was the topic of discussion? Amrule umay kashelach. They were a little suspect of him, and maybe from the end of the story, you'll see why they were suspect of him. Maybe there was a bit of a history with him. He said, "What's troubling you? What, you have a question about something? What do you want?" Amar lehu, he says, "Oh, in fact, I do have a question. Here's my question. Tanan, it says in the Mishnah, shtilei truma shenitmeu ushtalan tehorim miletameh va'asurim mila'echol." It says, if you take saplings of truma, okay, you take something that you would, let's say grains grew, or I don't know, I'm thinking of garlics, right? You can plant garlic whole. So let's say you took garlic, right? That was truma garlic, and you planted it in the ground. Now the whole question is, and this is going to be the topic for most of today, which is, or part of today, which is, what does planting do? When you plant that, is it still truma? If it was tme'ah, is the truma still there? What exactly happened? So he says, if you take these saplings, the Mishnah says, saplings of truma, shenitmeu, that became impure, and then you planted them, okay? So they were already truma, now you plant them in the ground. Tehorimi litameh v'asurimi la'echol. Okay, it's a bit of a strange thing, and this is going to be the question of the Gemara. They're pure, meaning the impurity leaves them as soon as you put them in the ground. Because something new grows, it's not, okay, truma kind of leaves it. Okay, the truma is no longer there. But they're forbidden to eat. So now we're assuming that it means the Kohanim still can't eat them even though they were impure, right? Even though the impurity left them, they still can't eat them. So he asked Rava bar Matna, right? It sounds like some sort of paradox. If the tumah leaves them, then why should they be forbidden to eat? You should have been allowed to eat it, right? You should have been able to eat the food. So Amrule, right? Because now the whole issue is a Kohen can't eat truma that became impure, but now the impurity left when it starts to grow, so it should be fine. So Amrule, Hachi Amaraba, my asurin lisarim. We're going to have three different interpretations here. The first is what the brothers Avin and the sons of Avin answer him. It's going to be forbidden to non-Kohanim, meaning the truma leaves it, but it's still truma because you planted truma, and what grows is truma. Okay, so that's why. So now he says to them, that's not a good answer. Okay, this, by the way, they quote in their rabbi's name, in Rabba's name. They were learning in the school of Rabba. Umay kamashbalan. So what you're saying that now the whole issue is, if a Mishnah is teaching you something that already appears in another Mishnah, there's no point to tell us this. So he's saying, but that doesn't make any sense, because what are you trying to tell us? Gidulei truma. It's something that grows from truma. If you plant truma, what grows from there is still truma. That, Tanina, we already have a Mishnah that says that. Okay, it says also in Masechet Trumot, Gidulei truma. It says it explicitly. So you don't need this unexplicit way of saying it. It doesn't make any sense. Maybe you want to say the gidulim of the gidulim, meaning if you took this sapling that was truma, you planted it, what grew from there you replanted. If that were the case, right? So maybe that's what you want to say. Well, also that's not a chiddush, because umay kamash malan b'davar she'ein zaro kaleh. You want to say, if now this would only be the case. Okay, there's two ways of planting things. Either when you plant it, eventually whatever you plant disintegrates, so to speak, and something new grows, or the actual thing itself grows together with it. That means ein zaro kaleh, whatever you planted kind of grows as part of the new, whatever new that you're growing. So now gidulei gidulim, if zaro kaleh, if the seed is no longer there anymore, it decomposes, then we're going to basically say gidulei, then we're going to say it's obviously not going to be truma anymore. So what are you trying to tell us? The gidulei gidulim b'davar she'ein zaro kaleh, if it doesn't decompose, then it's going to be in it. Then it's going to still be truma. That also appears in the Mishnah. Hanami tanina. hatevel. Now, it's not in the case of truma, but it's in the case of tevel. If you plant something, let's say you take something that similar to this, where it had already grown, the first case, you had taken truma already from it, and this is the truma. In this case, it became obligated in truma, right? You did the flattening of the pile. Remember, we talked about that the other day. And then it was obligated in truma, and you didn't take truma. At this point, this is what we call tevel. It's forbidden. And now you plant the tevel in the ground. So if you plant tevel, which we're basically saying the halacha should be the same. Either it's truma or it's tevel. Both are forbidden, right? Tevel is forbidden to everybody. Truma is forbidden to anyone who's not a Kohen. So a tevel gidulav mutarin, b'davar shezaro kaleh. Okay, whatever grows from it is allowed if the seed disintegrates. Aval b'davar she'ein zaro kaleh. But if it doesn't disintegrate, afilu gidulei gidulin asuin ba'achila. So what do you see? Whatever they would try to think, the Avin brothers, that this truma that you planted is going to be forbidden to a zal because it's still truma, there's no chiddush there at all. It's all said in other mishnayot. That can't possibly be what this mishnah means. So therefore, now let's go back to our story. The two of them were sitting learning. Rabbi Bar Menashe comes and starts asking, Rabbi Bar Matna comes and starts asking them a question. They answer, and he says to them, that's not a good answer. Okay, so what's their response? Ishtiku, first they're silent. They don't say anything. They realize that's not a good answer. Amr le, and then they, Amre lo le, they say to him, Midi shmialach baha, maybe you have something to say about this. Now, maybe they knew that, right now, it's funny. He asked the question. You would think he didn't know the answer. But apparently it seems clear from the continuation of the story, he had an answer in his pocket, okay? And that's why I think that maybe he was coming to a little bit provoke them, right? He wasn't coming with pure intentions. So now he says, Amar lahu, Hachi Amar Rav Sheshet. Oh yeah, in fact, I have an answer. Rav Sheshet says that maybe he knew what Rabbi said, and maybe that's why he wanted to say, what did they say in the Beit Midrash, so that he could say, oh, you're wrong, okay, which is in fact what happened. And right, teaches you a little bit about the dynamics going on between the different rabbis and maybe the competition between the different schools. It's very possible. So he says, Hachi Amar Rav Sheshet, this is the way Rav Sheshet understood that source. My asurin lekohanim. It's forbidden to the kohanim. Now, why should it be forbidden? That was the whole question. If it's no longer tameh, then it should be okay, because what happened? We planted it, and the tuma leaves it. So he says, Hachi Amar Rav Sheshet, my asurin lekohanim, ho'il ve'ifsilu lahu behesech hadat. This is a different kind of psul. It's not pasul of tameh. It's a psul of hesech hadat. What's hesech hadat? Hesech hadat is, if you remember, the kohanim have to watch. It says v'shamru et mishmeret trumotai. Remember, we learned that whether trumotai is trumati or trumotai, singular, plural. Anyway, the point here is that you have to protect the truma. What do you have to protect it from? Well, from becoming tameh, really, right? From becoming impure somehow. But you have to watch it all the time. Now, when you put it, right, maybe this was something that was a psul from hesech hadat. You planted it. Now, the tuma, whatever tuma was there, is removed, but this psul of hesech hadat doesn't get removed by planting, okay? And that's what he says, and that's why the kohanim can't eat it. So now we're going to go on a big tangent to understand this issue of hesech hadat, and to say there's a big machloket, and to say that that only works if you hold on one side of that machloket. Okay, so they say, Hanichad, his opinion makes sense. Lemanda amar hesech hadat psula guf have shapir. If you say, okay, there's two ways to understand hesech hadat. Is hesech hadat, if you don't do this shmirah properly, since the Torah says you have to, this truma is disqualified. And no planting is going to take that off, basically, because this is what we call a psul haguf. The item itself becomes totally disqualified. You can't replant that and think something new is going to grow, and that's not going to be. But so then it works totally fine. Ela lamanda amar hesech hadat psul tuma have. But if you hold that hesech hadat is all, why can't you have hesech hadat? Because we're worried that if you don't watch it, what might happen? It might come in contact with something tameh. And it's just a concern. It's not that there's something wrong with not watching it. It's that if you don't watch it, there might be a bad result. It might become tameh. Well, if that's the case, what happens when you plant this? When you plant it, if it was, let's say it became tameh because you had hesech hadat. You weren't watching it. Then you planted it. Then what happens? Then you when you plant it, we already said, if it's tameh, it's not going to be tameh anymore. So if the whole issue is tumah related, then it's not a problem. Okay, so basically we're going to say here, it basically should have, the tumah should have come away from it, right? Disappeared once we planted it. So basically that doesn't really make any sense. So now we're going to go into that machloket. So we're basically going to say this answer of Rav Sheshet works if you hold, we're going to see like Rish Lakish, that it's a psul haguf, hesech hadat. And therefore, since there was hesech hadat, and then you planted it, the planting doesn't help the hesech hadat. It might help if there's tumah there, but it doesn't help hesech hadat. And that's why the Kohanim, since the Kohanim didn't watch it at some point, this doesn't help that psul. Now, let's talk about, but if you hold that it's just a concern, maybe it got tameh, then this answer isn't going to work. Di'itmar. How do we know about this machloket? It says there's a machloket amoraim. Hesech hadat Rabbi Yochanan amar psul tumahave. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish amar psul haguf have. So here you have the machloket. Rabbi Yochanan says it's psul tumah. Rish Lakish says it's psul haguf. What we're going to have in our structure right now, since we're off on this tangent, we're going to have the two opinions, what the reasoning of the two opinions is, and then we're going to have two questions that Rabbi Yochanan brings against Rish Lakish and how Rish Lakish answers them. That's going to be our structure for the next little bit. Rabbi Yochanan amar psul tumahave shim yavo Eliyahu v'yitarena shamin lo. That if Eliyahu were to show up and tell us that it actually, in the time that you weren't watching it, right? This is just a way of speaking, right? If later Eliyahu came and said, oh, by the way, it's true you weren't watching it, but nothing happened, it would be totally fine. That's what Rabbi Yochanan says. Since, right, he's basically, I'm sorry, I say it right? Yeah. And therefore, we listen, right? If he would tell us nothing happened, it would be fine then. So therefore, what do you see? It's not a psul haguf, it's just a concern, maybe it became tameh. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish omer psul haguf have, shim yavo Eliyahu v'yitarenu ein shom'in lo. If Eliyahu were to say, while you weren't watching it, nothing happened, no tumah came in contact with it, you still wouldn't be able to listen to him. It's not like you'd be able to say, oh, now I can eat it. No, it's disqualified entirely because the Torah says you didn't watch it, right? You have to watch it. You didn't watch it, it disqualifies it. So it's not exactly the reason, but they're kind of each describing their approach and what the ramifications are of their approach. So Eitivei Rabbi Yochanan l'Rish Lakish. Now we're going to assume that hesech hadat is not only true for truma, it's also true, obviously, for kodshim, which is even more holy and sanctified. Anything in the temple, sacrifices, things that are sanctified in the temple would be more severe. So it would be the same, basically. Okay, we're going to assume if you hold hesech hadat is psul haguf for truma, you would hold it also for kodshim. So now Rabbi Yochanan says to Rish Lakish, again, Rish Lakish held it's psul haguf, it's disqualified itself. Rabbi Shmuel ben Yoshua Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Omer, Lul katan haya ben kevesh lemizbeach b'ma'aravo shel kevesh, shesham hayu zorkim psulei chatat ha'of, v'tu'ubar tzuratam v'yotzin lebeit ha'srifa. Okay, Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, says, this is a Tosefta in Zvachim, there was a little, there's a bit of a debate about what this is, but I looked it up in Midot, and it seems very clear from there that in Midot, where it describes all the parts of the temple, it describes that on the western side of the altar, this is the big altar, the western side is the side that faces the Heichal, the inner sanctuary. On that side of the altar it was a big base, and then there was a ramp. Okay? On the western side of that ramp, imagine a staircase. Sometimes people have a crawl space in a staircase where you can store things. So likewise, the kevesh of the Mizbeach, there was this hole that they made, like a window type thing or a little box. It was an open area on the western side where it went in. They say even like the length of the arm of a person, and it was 1 by 1 cubit of height and width, and the depth was the hands, the length of a person's hand or arm. Sorry, arm, not hand. And it was this little katan ben kevesh lemizbeach. It was right where the ramp met the altar. In that space there. Shesham hayuzorkim. I'm just telling you that Rashi explains it a little differently here, but it seems to make a lot more sense according to the Mishnah in Midot. Shesham hayuzorkim psulei chatat ha'of. That's where they would put any chatot ha'of, bird sin offerings that became disqualified. First of all, there were a lot of bird sin offerings became disqualified because of there. It's interesting. Each sugya kind of has a focus of their own. Here we're going to say it must be the psul of our psul that we were talking about, the hesech hadat. But there it talks about that it seems, the commentaries there say, it seems that the issue is, if you remember, Chatad often got disqualified or couldn't be used right away because of the women. Remember all the women who had miscarriages, and it wasn't always clear whether their miscarriage was late enough or not, whether they actually needed to bring the korban. So often they had these cases where you can't sacrifice it. We just talked about this the other day, but you also can't burn it. So now the issue is going to be here that if it really became disqualified, what would you do? A sacrifice that becomes disqualified, you burn right away. In this case, they would take the animal, okay, and they would, this is the animal, they would take it, and what would they do? Ti'ubar tzuratan v'yotzin lebeit hasrefa. They wouldn't burn it right away. They would wait until its form changed, okay? It's not exactly clear what this means. Some people think this means you have to wait till it gets disgusting, and only then can you burn it, meaning this is because it's something in between. If it was fully disqualified, you'd be able to burn it right away. If it's not disqualified, then what do? You know, it's pseudo disqualified. You can't sacrifice it, but you also can't burn it. So you're going to leave it in the azara still because it's still sanctified. And then you're going to wait till, okay, now this is not what Rashi says. It sounds like tubar tzuratan till it becomes, right, somehow disgusting. And then you can already burn things that become disgusting. Just like Shemitah produce, some people wait until it rots, right, until you throw it out. So things like that. But Rashi says the psul is psul lina. You wait until you leave it overnight. Now, anything that you slaughter during the day has to be dealt with that day. If you leave it overnight, it becomes disqualified for having been left overnight. So they would leave it in this little cubby overnight. The next morning, they'd already be able to burn it because now it became something that was left overnight, a psul of lina. It had a different psul. Either which way, they would leave it in this space. Okay, so now the question is, what's the psul? If it was this, if you say, now they're assuming that what's the psul that we're talking about? The psul that we're talking about is hesech hadat. You had hesech hadat because they're assuming that there's only X number of categories of psulim. If it was pigul or notar, something like that, you would be able to burn it right away. If the Kohen had the wrong intent when he was slaughtering it and thought, I'm going to put it on the altar at a different time, at the wrong time. So like tomorrow. So that would make it pigul and you'd be able to burn it right away. So they figure if it's not that, it must be something else. Must be hesech hadat. So now they say, even though, like I said, a midot, they assume, and this is an interesting thing about Gemara in general, there when the commentaries discuss it in its place, seems like the issue is these women who had, and that's why they specifically made it for the chatot ha'of. And by the way, why was it on that side of the altar? Because that was the side where they did the slaughtering of the bird. So it was right there, and when it would become disqualified, they would put it in there. Be right nearby. You think about to what extent they figured out the details of the temple, that everything be very organized. So anyway, they say here, they understand it differently. They say it must be hesech hadat. So if you say bishlama psul tumahave, which is what Rabbi Yochanan says, this matches perfectly with me. Why? Maybe it became impure. We don't know. In other words, at some point, somebody wasn't watching it. We don't know if it became impure or not. That's why you can't burn it right away. Now, it's not that really we assume Eliyahu might come overnight and tell us that this is okay. But the point is, maybe it's not really tameh. And that's why we can't burn it right away. We have to have a different excuse for burning it. But if you say it's really in and of itself is pasul, then lamali ibor tzura. You don't need ibor tzura. You can burn it right away. Anything that it inherently became impure or problematic, disqualified, you're allowed to burn. How do we know this? V'hatnan, it says in the Mishnah, Ze'akla, kol shepsulo begufo, yisaref miyad, bedamu b'ba'alim, tu'ubar tzuratam v'yotzin lebeit hasrefa. Here it says it, if it's a psul in the goof of the animal, the body of the animal, then it gets burnt right away, which would include, if you say hesech hadat is a psul aguf, then you would say you would burn it right away. So Rish Lakish, you're obviously wrong. What's the damu ba'alim to ubar tzuratan? That's if the blood, let's say, spilled or became impure, or the owners of the korban became impure, in which case you've already designated the animal is now disqualified, right? But the animal became disqualified not because of itself, but because of its connection to someone or something that became disqualified, which means in that case, you can't burn it right away. You have to wait till it to ubar tzuratan. Okay. When I say animal, I mean the dead animal, obviously, because there's no blood until the animal's slaughtered, right? So we're obviously talking about once the animal's sacrificed. Okay. So now not sacrificed, but they slaughtered it. So Amalei Hai Tana debe Rabba Baravuahu da Amar afilu pigol ta'un ibor tzura. So Rish Lakish answers him, no, you could say that the Tana there is Rabba Baravua, who says even pigol needs ibor tzura. And therefore, he disagrees with kol shulo baguf yisaref miyad. And that's how he understands that source. Even pigol would, all the more so, hesech hadat, even if it's only, right, even if it's psul haguf, it still needs to wait. In other words, this is a different approach, that if it's psul haguf, you still can't burn it right away. You still have to wait for ibor tzura. Okay, and that's how Rish Lakish answers the question against. Second question against Rish Lakish, and then we'll get back to our topic, which was how to understand this case about the shtilim that were planted and grew, right? Why are they asurim? To who are they asurim? Okay, we'll get back to that soon. Eitive. So now we bring another Tanaitic source against, Rabbi Yochanan brings against Rish Lakish. Nitma, o shenifsal habasal, o sheyatzah chutz l'klaim. We have three cases here. It becomes impure, the meat. Again, we're in the temple here. Okay, remember our case originally was truma, but I said it's the same for the temple. Or the meat becomes disqualified, which we're going to assume our disqualification of hesech hadat, but it's not clear. Or the meat was taken outside the azara, which it's not allowed to be. It becomes disqualified if you do that. So what happens if before you sprinkle the blood, one of the following things happens? Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yizrok, he still thinks you could sprinkle the blood on the altar. Rabbi Yeshua Omer Lo Yizrok. Rabbi Yeshua says, no, you can't. Umodeh Rabbi Yeshua she'im zara kurtza. He says, but if you did it anyway, there's ritzui. Remember that means the Kohen Gadol wears the tzitz, and the tzitz atones for that, and it's okay. Your sacrifice is valid. So, my nifsal, lav be'aseh hadat, is it not haseh hadat? So now, if you say, maybe it became tamei, maybe it didn't, and that's the problem with haseh hadat, so now it makes sense why the tzitz can atone for it, because the tzitz can atone for doubt, cases of doubt, right? That makes sense. But so, but what? How could it possibly atone for something that, again, inherently is a psul haguf? This is a problem, right? You wouldn't say pikul you can do ritzoi for. If you sacrifice a korban that had pikul, remember the Kohen had the wrong intent. That for sure, the tzitz doesn't help you. It's a totally invalid korban. So likewise, if you say Rish Lakish that's psul haguf, this shouldn't work at all. So they say you misunderstood nifsal. Nifsal isn't what you thought. Nifsal beheseh hadat. Rish Lakish says, my nifsal b'tful yom. A tful yom came in contact with it. What's a tful yom? Someone who went to the mikveh in the morning, but it hasn't yet become nightfall, and they're not allowed to bring their korban until they're pure. Now, if you remember, forget about the korban. That I didn't mean to say. That's not relevant here yet. A tful yom, remember we talked about it, that the rabbis institute that tful yom he's mitame, kind of like, okay, and I say kind of like a sheni, not 100%, but he's like a sheni. And let's assume that this, what we're talking about, was a sacrifice that the meat was nifsal by a tful yom. Okay, so now, if it was nifsal by a tful yom, then already we can say the ritzoi works, right? So now they say ihachi hainu tameh, but wait, the source listed nitma, it became impure, or nifsal habasal. Now you're going to say both are tameh. So they say, yeah, trei gavne tameh. Yeah, these are two different types of tuma. One is, a higher level, and this is a tful yom. Okay, and that's the answer. So Rish Lakish answers this question, and now we're going back to our issue. So again, let's just review. You can look at the chart also on the first side of the page. We had the Avin brothers who say it's tameh, it's tahor once you plant it, but it becomes forbidden for zarim because it's still truma. And Rav Sheshet said, right, which we said, what do you mean though? Isn't that already says in a different Mishnah that anything you plant truma, it will be truma? Rav Sheshet, who said it's only for Kohanim, and it's forbidden, we know it's forbidden to Zarim. The Chiddush here is it's even forbidden to Kohanim, even though it was Tameh, because we're talking about a case where it was Ifsalu Beheseh Hadat. Okay, it wasn't classic Tameh, right? It was also Tameh, but it was also Nifsal Beheseh Hadat, and because of that, and that only works though if you say that Heseh Hadat is Psul Aguf. Because if you say it's a psul, maybe it became tamei. Once you planted it, the tumah should leave it. So that's the problem with his answer. Kisalik Rabin, when Rabin went up to Eretz Yisrael, Amrei l'shmate kamei de Rabbi Yirmiyah. He brought what Rav Sheshet said to Rav Yirmiyah. The Amar, here's one of our favorite lines. shows you the tension between the Israelis and the Babylonians in those days. Bavlai tipshai, you stupid Babylonians. What are you talking about? Mishum diyatve ba'ara dechashocha, you live in a dark land. Amritan shmate de machashru, you say dark things, meaning things that make no sense. Lo shmiya lechu hada Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish mishmei Rabbi Yoshaya. Didn't you hear what Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said in the name of Rabbi Yoshaya? What did he say? Me hachag shenitmeu. Now we get into a whole different topic. Now we're talking about the water libations that they did on Chag Sukkot. So if you have water that you designated for Sukkot for these water libations, and they became impure, nitmeu. Now, if you remember, food and drink cannot become, you can't put them in a mikveh and purify them, other than water. If you remember, we said that water can be purified. You can put it, what you do is you put it in a bowl that, like stone, which doesn't accept tuma, okay, it's not susceptible to impurity. You put it in a bowl, you put the bowl inside, kind of, face up, and as soon as the water touches the top of the water, it purifies the water, okay? So water has a way to be purified. It's called hashaka, like from nishika, kissing, okay? It's like as if it touches. So me hachag shenitmu, if you have water that was designated for the water libations and it became impure, if hishikan, first you touched it into the water, and then you sanctified it. Generally, when you say sanctified, we mean you put it in the kli sharet. Okay, there's different stages of taking the water. You take the water, you designate it, that's fine. But if you put it in the holy bowl, then it has sanctity to it. So if you fixed it before you put it in the kli sharet, the holy bowl, then tehorim, then it's all fine. But hikdishan, va'acharka hishikan, if first you put that water into a bowl, that it was impure, but anyway, you put it in that kli sharet, and then you try to purify it, tzme'im, then it's not going to work, okay? Why not? We're going to assume, okay, we're going to see the wording the Gemara is going to use in a minute, ma'ala asu b'kodeshim. This is a special stringency by kodshim. We treat kodshim differently than anything else. Once it's sanctified, we don't allow this whole thing, and now what they're going to compare is hashaka to planting. We're going to say hashaka and planting are the same thing because what does it do? Both of them kind of, right, takes away the tuma. Okay, and some people even call it, there's a nice note in the Quran where it says it's basically it's basically purifying something through nullification. Okay, you're nullifying it, you're canceling out whatever was tameh, right? When you plant it, so it kind of a whole new thing grows. So it's nullified, and you have a little bit of tameh, and then there's this whole big thing that grows. And likewise, here you're putting it in the water and it basically becomes nullified. So you don't have to understand it that way, but it's one way to look at it. So he says, Michti zri'aninu, mali hishikan, v'achar kach hikdishan, mali hikdishan, v'achar kach hishikan. He says, but if this is like planting, where it kind of takes away the tumah, what's the difference if it was sanctified or it wasn't sanctified? Alma ein zri'a lehekdesh, hachanami ein zri'a letruma. So he says, therefore, it must be, when it comes to sanctified items like truma and kodshim, planting doesn't get rid of the tuma entirely, okay? And therefore, you can't do it. So he gives a different reason, which is basically, yes, they're teholim, really, technically speaking, but since they were sanctified items, either they were truma or they were sacrificial items that were sanctified or, libations, they are treated more stringently, okay? Even though there's really no tuma, it's a stringency that they instituted for this purpose. So Yativ Ravdimi v'Karmele lahashmata. We see this a lot, all right? Everyone keeps passing around the Torah, right? So someone says it to somebody else. So he says the following, Amalei Abai, Ravdimi, if you remember, was the one who brought, right? Ravin and Ravdimi both went back and forth. So Ravdimi now is coming from Israel and comes to Babylonia, as opposed to the previous was the reverse. Ravin was going to Israel. And Amalei Abai, so Abai says to him, okay, I understand this approach, but I want to know the following. Hikdishan b'kli ka'amar, aval b'peh lo avid rabbanan ma'ala, or dilma b'peh nami avid rabbanan ma'ala. When you say that we're going to treat it more significantly, is it only if, as I explained before, that you put it in the kli, in the vessel, that's holy, right? There were all these, if you don't understand this idea of kli sharet, I'll just explain briefly. There were vessels in the temple that were considered kli sharet, and when you put it in, you basically, it became sanctified by putting it in the bowl. I'm going to come across this a lot over time. So there's two different ways to sanctify, right? The first stage is just saying, I'm going to use this for the libations, for the water libations. The next stage is putting it in the kli sharet. So Abai wants to know this special stringency by Kodshim, is it only once it's in the bowl? Because I said you put it in the bowl, but it's not clear when it says Hikdishan. You could have just said, I am using this for the libations, and that already sanctifies it. So which one did you mean? Did you mean both or only one? Only the Kli? Amar lo, zolo shamati. Rabbi Abai says that one I don't, right? Sorry. Abai asked Rav Dimi. Rav Dimi says that I never heard, but kayotze bo shamati. But I did hear something similar. Okay, I'm just going to quote Rabbi Abai, quoting Rabbi Yochanan. To Amar Rabbi Abai, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, anavim shenitmeu. So we get back to why on earth are we learning this? Because in the end, this is going to connect to something we saw in yesterday's daf. Anavim shenitmeu. Remember the grapes? And the whole question was, are they considered a separate entity or are they part of the grape itself, the inside of it? So anavim shenitmeu, Rabbi Yochanan said, derachan, va'achar kach hikdishan tehorim. Hikdishan, va'achar kach derachan tmeim. If you tread on them and then you sanctify them, then they're going to be tehorim. In other words, when the juice came out, we're going to say, okay, this is basically a way of saying, we're going to view it as if mifkab kideh, right? That they're a separate entity. And therefore, when they come out, it's fine. And if later you sanctify them for, let's say, the wine libations, it's fine. But hikdishan, if first you sanctify them for the temple, v'achar kach derachan, oh, sorry, I should say like this. It's really not for the temple, it's for truma. If you sanctify them for truma, to be truma, and then you tread it on them, tmeim, then they're going to be impure. Why are they going to be impure? Because ma'ala asu b'kodeshim. Right? This is truma. We're going to treat truma more significantly. We're going to say, this is very interesting. Instead of saying there's a debate conceptually, is it mifkab kideh or is it mivla blieh? It's actually considered one and the same. We're going to say it depends. When you're talking, if it's already truma, then we're going to treat it more severely. And we're going to say it's as if it's all one unit. And if the outside became tameh, the inside became tameh also. But if you say it's not, if it's not sanctified yet, then we're going to be more lenient and say mifkab kideh. Okay, this is sometimes where halacha l'maaseh doesn't always go with, right? Do you view it this way or that way? It could come up with a combination and say it depends on the situation. We'll be more strict when it comes to sanctified items and less strict when it doesn't. What's the point here, though? What does this have to do with anything? What do you see here? You see that they did a ma'ala b'kodeshim, right? They're treating kodshim more severely. Now, how do you separate truma? Right? Is there kedushat hapeh and kli sharet? No, there's no kli sharet. The only way you separate truma is by saying this is truma. That's bepeh. So here you see hanavim de kedusha peninhu vafilu hachid avirabana ma'ala. Even though it's just from your mouth, here they made it significant. Therefore, we're going to say the same by kodashim. But Amar Rav Yosef, no, you can't learn it from there. Anavim kamar ta'achav anavim shel truma askinan. These were grapes of truma, right? They could have been kodshim, but he's saying no. This case that they were talking about was specifically truma. That's when we saw it quoted before. Tikdushat haped ditu kikdusha klidanya. There is no. That's the highest thing you can possibly do with truma is to use kedushat haped. But when it comes to sacrificial items, to buy kli, since you're supposed to put them in a utensil, bepelo avirabana mala. Maybe you'd say there, right? It all depends. It's what's right for that item. When it's truma, there is only kedushat hapeh. So kedushat hapeh is obviously going to sanctify it. But when you're supposed to put it in a kli sharet to sanctify it, and all you did was kedushat hapeh and you designate it with your mouth, then we're not going to say ma'ala asu b'kodeshim. So he disagrees with what Rabbi Avau suggested. Okay, now we're going to go a little more in depth into this case. Derachan, wait a minute, there's a problem. Ba'afilu tuva. It sounds from here different from what we said the other day. And not only that, but Rabbi Yochanan said it here, Rabbi Yochanan said it there. What did we say? You can squeeze them out as long as you don't have a kibetza of grapes. If you have a kibetza of grapes, it's going to be matami, the juice on its way out. So afilu tuva, it sounds here like any amount should be okay. Umiyamar Rabbi Yochanan hachik, Rabbi Yochanan really said that. V'hamar Rabbi Yochanan, anavim shenitmeu dorcham pachot mikibetza. You have to have less than a kibetza of grapes in order for the juice not to become tameh on its way out. So we're going to give two answers. Ibait ema hachanami pachot mikibetza. Maybe also when he said it, he just didn't mention it, maybe because it wasn't important for our purposes. But it's also less than a kibetza. He didn't mean more than that. V'ibait ema. Maybe the two cases are different cases of tuma. In the first case, in the other case, on the other page, the grapes that come in contact with the rishon, the grapes were a sheni. When you squeeze out the juice, it'll become a shlishi, and a shlishi is a problem for truma, remember? But Hacha, here, denagu b'sheni, the grapes maybe here touched a sheni l'tuma, which means dehavalu shlishi, the grapes become a shlishi. They can't make the juice a revi because there is no revi by truma. So maybe the cases they're discussed are different cases of tuma. Okay, that's the other option. Okay, last thing for today. Amar Rava, af ananami tanina. Okay, now we're going to bring 3 proofs for something. Okay, exactly what that something is a bit unclear. Okay, Rashi says, af ananami tanina de avid rabana ma'ala b'kodashim va'afilu b'kedushat hapeh. Okay, that this is coming as a proof for the fact that, right, what Rabbi Avau said, which is even b'kedushat hapeh, the rabbis did ma'ala b'kodashim, right? Because he proved it for the Truma case, which Rav Yosef said not necessarily. He proves it from the Truma case. Some people say it's just trying to prove ma'ala b'kodashim in general and not specifically b'peh, okay? But we'll just keep it general right now. All of these are going to show that we treat kodshim more stringently, okay? More stringent than the actual law. That there's the law, and then there's kodshim goes beyond that. This is about the para aduma waters. What does this teach you? That you're supposed to take it. It sounds like mayim chayim. You have to be fresh water. What does fresh water mean? Take it directly from the river. In other words, don't put it in a different utensil and from there put it in the sanctified utensil. No, take your sanctified utensil and draw it directly the water from its source. But the word vinatan sounds like you put vinatan sounds like you place something that's already been displaced. Okay, they assume that word seems to indicate otherwise. But don't you have to take it when it's attached? In other words, how does this work? So what they're saying is it must be that the rabbi said, really, vinatan seems to indicate you place the water in the kli sharet, meaning you take the water, put it in some utensil, take it from there and put it in the sanctified utensil. But the rabbi said, no, we have to treat kodshim more seriously and therefore take it directly and don't include a middle vessel. Amar of Shimi bar Ashi, and therefore, since they did it there, they treated it more stringently also in our case. I want to finish up to the Mishnah. Amar of Shimi bar Ashi, af ananami tanina, taval ve'ala ochel b'maaser. When you go to the mikvah and you come out of the mikvah, this is any regular person who goes to, actually we're talking about a mitzorah here, sorry. A mitzorah has a 7-day purification process. On the 7th day in the morning, he goes to the mikvah. He gets out of the mikvah, he can already eat maaser. If he's a Levi, let's say, and he wants to eat the maaser of the Levi, it doesn't have so much sanctity, he can eat it even after he just goes to the mikvah. But we all know, he has to wait till the nighttime in order to what? Ochel b'truma, right? Truma is more sanctified, you have to wait till nighttime. What do you see from here? B'truma'im, b'kodshim lo, but it doesn't say there he could eat sacrificial meat. So, amai tahorhu, why not? He's already fully pure. If you remember, what did we learn? You have to bring your sacrifice the next day, and only after that can you eat the sacrificial meat. So, why? If he's totally tahor, it should be fine. Ela ma'ala, chanami ma'ala. Again, another stringency they instituted. You can't eat sacrificial meat until you bring your korban. It's not enough to be fully pure. It's still not enough. Last one, Amarav Ashiaf Ananami Tanina, Veha Basar. We saw this the other day. Basar that becomes impure. Now, Basar seems to indicate food. Lerabot etaitzim va'alavona. This comes to include even trees and frankincense. They can also become tameh. So again, etzimu levona b'nei tamuyeninu. Nobody eats them. They shouldn't, right? Tumat ochlin. It should be only food. Ela ma'ala hachanami ma'ala. Again, this is a higher level sanctification that they did. Here we see they treated sanctified items more stringently than they should have. So outside the temple, that never would have been, but inside the temple, we have a whole different set of rules. Okay, and that's what they're saying to prove this idea about their asurimi le'echol because of this concept of ma'ala asur b'kodashim. We'll end here. I'll just give you a sneak preview into tomorrow, which is tomorrow's daf gets into what can you make matzah out of, what is forbidden to eat chametz from, which grains, and it gets into the famous issue of kitniot. Okay, so if you're interested in the topic of kitniot, so listen to tomorrow's shir. So have a Shabbat Shalom, and it's Tzom Kal, everybody, an easy fast, and we'll be back tomorrow or whatever on Shabbat recorded and Sunday back together on Zoom. Shabbat Shalom.